Hi, my name is Dave Reske, CEO of Now Speed Marketing, and welcome to this edition of Marketing in the Now, where we talk about the best ideas in digital marketing and marketing strategy in general. And my guest today is Mark Brandau, CMO of Brightmine. Mark has over 15 years of experience at human capital management industries at high growth innovative companies, including SAP SuccessFactors, Forrester, ICIMS, and now Brightmine. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
You've
Appreciate it.
had you've had so much deep experience. I should ask you, what was your favorite job among all of those?
You know,
Trick question, I
it
know.
is a trick
So,
question. I think they've all really been fun in their own way, but I probably would have to go back to the beginning, or at least on the HR tech part of the career, which you mentioned, right? Which would probably be a little company called Plateau Systems, which was a learning company which was acquired where I went to work, and then it was acquired by SuccessFactors. SuccessFactors was acquired by SAP, and as you mentioned, I stayed at SAP for about 10 years, but that journey was pretty dynamic and pretty fast and pretty fun and high growth era, right? So it was exhausting at times, as you can imagine, and it was exhilarating at times. But I think that journey of multiple acquisitions, multiple drops, and then a big growth curve into SAP was really a lot of excitement, a lot of fun.
fascinating. So that, a lot of change. You managed the change well and through the different positions, and I think sometimes those jobs earlier in our career, we learn a lot, and that's exciting. Well, it sounds more mid-career for you, but
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
pretty exciting.
yeah.
Well, we've been talking about, a fascinating subject for CMOs, which is the changing role of CMOs in B2B organizations. And you've had deep experience in this area yourself. And one of the issues that you brought up was that the CMO role frequently has the lowest tenure of any senior executive in the C-suite. Why do you think that is, and what are the factors do you think have affected the role of the CMO in recent years?
Probably like a lot of my colleagues and maybe ourselves, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that because it's directly relevant to, um, uh, livelihood and what we do and how we do it. But I think there's some pretty obvious things at the end of the day. And I kind of look at in anything like this, I look at two things. I look at the external factors and I look at internal factors, right? There's a little bit of yin and yang that influence what's going on around the business. I think for the CMO and the external factors, I think they kind of speak for themselves. The pace of change is constantly increasing for businesses. So these big events that used to happen, I don't know, once every 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, are now happening every 18 months and every, year. And that's only going to accelerate. So the pace of significant change is accelerating. And that just throws off whether that's technology change or demographic change or skills change and generational changes in the workforce. That just throws off tons of other things externally, like compliance issues and growth expectations and availability of capital in a market. So there's a ton of external reasons that start to push on the internal. And the internal goes, well, I don't know, we're going to get new funding or we're going to get a partnership agreement because we need to stimulate growth. We're going to need, and this is what makes me really nervous, is we're going to need somebody, at least staying in marketing, we're going to need somebody who's gone from 20 million to 26 million inside of six, and it gets really specific and almost ridiculously specific to the moment of like, I need it for this. So it becomes temporary, right? It becomes, I need to get from A to B in 18 months, eh, period. And I need somebody who's done that 5 times.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And so it becomes extremely transactional as opposed to saying, we're going to have a 5 to 10 year run, and I need to look at an arc, that's a little different. Those days might be gone. I don't know. But they feel like they're rare. When you can look at, you were just asking about that journey I had and multiple acquisitions, pretty rare right now. Well, they've always been relatively rare, but I think the pressure of get me from A to B in 18 months, and then I got to look for somebody who can get me from B to C in another 36 months because they're different is what creates a lot of this.
So do you think that that's the external factor? Is it extreme pressure from the investors to the board to the CEO that comes down to the CMO that creates that super transactional need to do this one specific thing? You would think as enlightened uh, managers, as we've kind of moved from an era where we thought we were moving from this factory mode driven, top down hierarchical system of management to a collaborative, engaging, trust based
Sure.
style of management, right? But what you're describing is really this extreme pressure that happens at the senior level that creates this need for this or this perceived need. I'm not sure it's a real need, but it's a perceived need for this very specific thing that creates turnover, right? So I don't know, how do you make sense of all that?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive, right? Like this notion of collaborative, trust-based, what have you. You can have that in a pressure cooker. I think of wartime situations. If you're in, never served, but I would suspect that that is there. You're going to have a lot of trust. You're going to have a lot of trust and camaraderie and support in an extremely pressure-driven environment. So I think those dynamics can be there, but they have to be put on display, and it's not, available. The other thing I want to be clear is it sounds like, and I certainly am skewed towards more of the technology environments, of course, where I've tended to operate. But I think this is permeating into other industries because most other industries, whether it's finance or healthcare or what have you, have become technology companies, data-oriented companies over time. And I think that it permeates there, maybe not as extreme, but the statistic you sort of keyed off of, or the point of the high turnover is across industries. It's not exclusive to tech. Um, I think the changes in role expectations feed into that. I think like you said, I think that's right. The pressure and the expectations feed into that. I think there's multiple reasons. I don't think there's one silver bullet that says, oh, it's because of this, that there's high turnover in a CMO. And I think, frankly, I think that one of the other things I didn't mention is the need or the purview of marketing is very, very broad, and in some cases very, very deep, or can be. And I think that gets back to the individual and where they come from, as a marketing leader, right? So, um, growth, pipeline, demand generation, positioning in market, category definition, these are all different things. Partner marketing, field marketing, these are all very different things. Um, God forbid if you also have responsibility for SDR or BDRs and an internal selling team, that's yet another discipline. So, I think companies, to your point, maybe should take a deeper look at what maybe skilled marketing leadership is. We used to call full stack marketers, right? Can do, and make investments appropriately as opposed to hiring for the 12-month, I need this, and then I'm going to hire this, and I'm going to hire this. Um, I don't know. That's what comes to mind. Do you really want a full stack, somebody to go on that journey with you, or do you want somebody who's, pick your bad analogy. You want somebody to play around the golf with you in every hole for 18 holes, or do you want to call in somebody who's going to just be the expert at putting the ball, when
Yeah,
you get on the green?
right.
Pick your bad analogy, right? But that's kind of what it is, right? And I think you need somebody who's going to play the round with you because to advise when you need advice and to hit the shots when you need to hit the shots, that's what you need.
Yeah, so let's kind of explore that a little bit further. What does it take, rather than bemoaning the current state of the industry, which I could easily do, but because this constant turnover in the C-suite at the CMO level creates a lot of challenges for the rest of the organization. It creates challenges, learning curve. There's a lot of risk in bringing a new senior executive on board. There's a lot of risk in employee turnover, the rest of the staff. There's all kinds of issues. So let's just kind of think about like what would it take to bring on for a CMO to kind of own that role and and be the right person, through the different growth stages of a company. So how does that, how would you how should CMOs be approaching
Well,
that piece?
I mean, it's highly dependent on the business and the team, but I can say something I've observed and maybe an observation, something that served me reasonably well is, um, it's something I've always advised to businesses and even when I was at Forrester is I think it's really hard. A lot of CMOs are kind of hard charging, right? The approach is, here's what we're going to do and why.
Hmm.
Rah, rah, right? Here's what we're going to do and why. That's really dangerous. And I think that's really, it's aggressive and sometimes it's good. But I think at the end of the day, at least my experience is to take more of a advisory kind of approach and almost a stewardship approach in being in service of the investors and the business. And instead of saying, here's what we're going to do and why, but to say, here's what I would advise, one, two, three, and then here's the magic phrase, what do you think?
Hmm.
To make sure that people are bought in, and I mean everybody, right? Whether depending on where you're in the business, of course, the executive team and the investors and what have you, and what the issue is, but to get alignment and not be selling as hard, but to say, look, from an advisor, here's what I would recommend based on everything we know and the diligence that I did. What key phrase, what do you think? And do that more. I think that's part of it. I think that's part of the discussion to go back to um, bad golf analogy is it's one thing to storm down the thing and just take shot after shot. It's another thing to stop and talk with your people you're playing with and maybe a cat or so and go, what do you think?
Hmm.
I'm lying here, we're lying there, we have things over here and go, what do you think we should do? And then agree on those steps. I think getting a little more alignment can go a long way.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is really like core leadership skills
Mm.
that are important for the CMO to um, have, right? And kind of be able to move through these different phases of a company, right? So, and what you said before is you need leadership skills around strategy alignment, right? Market positioning, branding, all of that. And then managing operations and then managing results in terms of pipeline building and campaigns and all of that. So that takes extreme leadership skills to be able to put all that together with agencies, with contractors, perhaps with employees, with in kind of building all of that alignment. All those soft skills. Putting all that together. So, in your experience, what are the most important leadership skills that you think that are necessary for that CMO to stay relevant through those different phases of growth, for a company?
I think it's kind of the traditional things, but I think they're often overlooked maybe. I think number one is staying on the revenue
Mm.
and the data and constantly, not constantly, that's not fair, consistently providing results and updates. And we all, considering this could be a metrics session, right? And talk about metrics. I don't want to go down that path. We can, but I don't want to necessarily go down that path. But just to say, look, be consistent and transparent. And here's the thing, not overcomplicated. As we all know in marketing, there's tons of metrics, from open rate to, conversion rate. We can go crazy on metrics, share voice all day long, but at the end of the day, you have to keep it simple. For every dollar that goes into marketing, are you getting $1.50 out?
Mhm.
The roaming. And we have to be clear on that. And of course, have data backup, but You have to speak clearly in the language of business and consistently. I think that's one. I think the leadership skill around that is important. The second, right there with that um, is constantly be in service of your people. Meaning for me, I'm not the one that's, on the front line necessarily. There are times and places where that's appropriate, right? Of course, where I should be there presenting and showing up without question. But most of the time, a lot of times it's direct reports. And the game is let's coach them up and train them to
Mm.
to do the presentation, to deliver the news, to do the pipeline coverage update, to talk about positioning and messaging, to lead a creative campaign. It's doing that type of work that shows you're building out depth and breadth and your team has got the ball. So, I think from a leadership perspective, it's always putting your team first. It's going back to the data and the revenue and consistent um, metrics. And I think that if there's a third around this, I would say is, um, in addition to the transparency and developing of the team, I think it's the customer piece of this, and I'm sort of implicating the field a little bit, but staying on the customer and revenue approach. And if there aren't good listening mechanisms in place, right, whether that's customer communities or forums, or you're not meeting with customers and talking with customers, that has to stay front of mind consistently. And that sounds like, of course, but a lot of times that falls off. That falls off the radar. So I think it's keeping a pulse with customers and a very active pulse with the field directly, not through so and so, not through so and so, but means talking to the solution consultants and people doing demos. What's working? What's not working?
Mhm.
I think the transparency with data and I think the team development are sort of corner touchstones to me.
Yeah, I love that. I think that those things are all super important. So it can feel like a CMO, CMOs don't all have all of those skills, but it feels like the best CMOs can live at that level of like business results and be accountable for that with the data as you described. They can also live in that, that coaching and organizing and managing and leading the team, right? And then they're also on, I would probably put the piece about customer in is like they're staying relevant in terms of strategy, messaging, and who they're delivering results for. And it takes a special person, and I guess that's why you're in the C-suite. You are a special person, right? You have to be able to do all of those things all the time. You can't like it seems like you get into trouble if you just drift into, oh, I only talk about strategy,
Well, that's
or
that's
whatever.
exactly
Right.
right. So
Yeah.
let me give you the perfect. I mean, let me give you the perfect scenario because it happens to all of it, all the marketing leaders. When you show up on a call or you're in a room and the CEO's there, okay, and you go, "How's it going?" and you start talking. If you're relatively new to leadership, what are you going to talk about? Well, I can tell you what I'm going to talk about, and unless there's a bigger issue, I'm going to talk about the data, and I'm going to say, hey, here's where we're aligned on the data, and we have these results. I'm going to talk about my people. Did you know so and so did X, Y, and Z? And you know what else I'm going to talk about? Hey, I was on the phone with a customer,
Hmm.
and this is what we learned, and this is what we heard. Those touchstones are the business, right? Whether it's the people, the data, and the customers. And that helps create that discussion around the golf course as we play the holes, right? And what's going on with customers and where is the data and what are the results we need to see and how do we develop our teams? So, to your point, what are the discussions and the touchstones? Those are the key ones for me.
Yeah, I love that because I'm reminded of a quote by Jeff Bezos, and I won't get this exactly right, but he's doing this conference presentation and he says, "Hey, people always come up to me and say, 'Hey, what's going to change in the next 10 years?'" And he says, "What he'd rather think about is what's not going to change in the next 10 years." And what you just described is what not going to change, right? CMOs will always be asked about data and focus on results, right? The people that they're managing and leading, and hopefully that includes their agencies and their partners, right? And what's happening with the customer. And I think feels like if that the CMO stays on those three touchstones that you mentioned, that's going to be the secret to longevity and success. You can't control the winds of change, right, that are going to be out there, but you can be doing your job really well, really in all those areas.
I think that's well said. I think that's the pivot is whatever the winds bring in, and you never know. What we do know is we're going to have to figure out the response to those things against the data, what it's telling us against the people and against customers. Based on what's happening with the winds of change, what does that mean in terms of impacted data and forecasts? What does that mean for our team? What does that mean for customers? Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's well said. Yeah.
So, if we think about the winds of change, what are the most common winds of change that, in your experience, that CMOs need to be ready for, right? So, I'm thinking about an analogy on wind. I actually sail, and so when you're thinking about the wind, if you're kind of going into a sailing situation, you kind of need to know the weather, and you're setting yourself for what you're anticipating. If you've got all the sails up and you know there's a 25 knot breeze coming in, you're doing something wrong. So, what are those wins that you're seeing out there right now that CMOs need to be kind of getting ready for?
I think it's a great analogy on the sailing. I'm going to pivot a little bit because I'm not going to sit here and talk about AI. I'm not going to pivot on it because there's a ton of discussion around that, and the change that that's bringing is a whole series of podcasts onto itself from a technology perspective. But I think it was me, and I'm going to use your analogy. You mentioned that you sail and you said, look, I have to be prepared for whatever the conditions might be. So I think it'd be interesting to take a minute and go, well, how do you prepare yourself for what those conditions might be? You need to know that you have a reliable way to forecast the weather that you trust. And maybe you sit there and go, I don't trust this app for weather, this one. I need three of them because I'm going to triangulate what's coming in. You probably need a compass. You probably need to make sure you have, the sails are, in good shape. I'm not a sailor, so I'm not going to go too far with this, but there's probably a checklist of items before you go out, right?
Mhm.
That you would say, I need to check these things on where we're going before I go to make a decision to go. I would suggest that there's the same thing for marketers today, right? There should be, and here's the thing, the annual planning thing isn't frequent enough. A quarterly checklist, probably, of things before you go out for the next quarter. What's changed externally? What's changed internally? I don't know that a very good one exists, right? Like that fast checklist of like, where are we exactly? Other than the data, we know the talent pieces, we know some of the customer sentiment, but to really have a checklist like that, I'm not sure that I've seen one of those, but it might be interesting. But I think that's preparing and being ready for what's next is the key. Agility, adaptability, that muscle, that ability to do that is, I think, the critical thing.
Yeah,
So whether
wow.
it's AI, whether it's something else, you're going to be ready for whatever the weather throws you.
Yeah, wow. I think that's really powerful. And I think that that kind of conversation with the CEO, kind of having that checklist as you described and bringing that proactively to the CEO would be very powerful,
A
because
lot, a lot.
they're thinking about the future and the risk, right? And they need a leadership team that can help them get out in front of that so they're not surprised, right? That's very,
I think part of that, immediately pivots to what's best practice, what have been benchmarks, what's over time, and that could be part of it, right? Like, do you have a good sense of the three or five key things and a benchmark of where the indicators are going on those things, whether it's pipeline coverage, customer retention, talent, if not, maybe you should. And I'd suggest again that once a year is way too infrequent to do those things, given the pace of change, realistically. So I think instead of is the wind going to be north, south, dark clouds, light clouds, you kind of wake up and go, whatever it's going to be, we're going to do this checklist and be able to sail no matter what, or decide we're going to wait an hour or what have you. I think that's the most important thing.
yeah, I love that. As an agency, one of the things that we do is we create playbooks We put a big focus on this last year where we thought of different client situations and different marketing situations. Like what happens when you're running a PPC campaign and the results suddenly dip? Or what happens when you're working with a client and suddenly they don't respond or they don't engage or the new leadership person. So we've developed little playbooks for that. And do you think that model could be helpful for a CMO, kind of thinking about the future, like almost anticipating like what happens if revenue dies? We get a new CRO, board changes, we get new investment, kind of thinking. And is there training that helps a CMO do that, or do CMOs have to invent that all themselves,
I
one
think
at a
yes
time?
and no. I think yes, it would be helpful, and I don't know of anything that exists. And if somebody sees this and puts it in the comments, great. I mean, but I don't think there's any training that prepares that I've seen that does that. That says, to your point, look, it's one thing to do a best practice, or what do you do if a campaign drops or a certain channel doesn't work for paid or digital advertising. You can pivot around that and put in best practice all day, but there are those um, third rail topics that
Hmm.
are a little harder and a little more dangerous to get around. Like you mentioned, what happens if you have a new CEO comes in? What happens if those you have a new investor come in? What do you do? What should you do? I haven't seen a lot that articulate those approaches, but again, creating that all-weather CMO for longevity, back to the top point, I think that's what this starts to outline, perhaps.
Love it. I love the all-weather CMO. So the CMO that lasts. Well, I wish this conversation and your approaches help other CMOs kind of think about how to last in the changing winds of our complicated times. So, Mark, this has been an amazing conversation. You've had so much deep experience here. Thank you for sharing all this. If
Thanks for
uh,
having me.
if people want to get in touch with you and learn more about you, or further the conversation, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Hit me up on LinkedIn. Just DM me on LinkedIn. It's great. I'd be happy to have a chat. And thank you again, David, for the time. It's been fun, my pleasure.
Great.
Somehow we covered golf and boating in the same discussion, some marketing stuff. So that's all. Maybe summer's on the brain, so that's a good thing.
I think it is. Yeah, I think we're all ready for that. But thank you, Mark. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks again.